You might have noticed something strange about people who grew up decades ago. When they look at the modern world, they don't panic, they don't seem overwhelmed, and they rarely react the way younger generations do. Instead, they smile quietly, almost like they know a secret the rest of us missed. That's because the environment they grew up in shaped their brains in a way that almost doesn't exist anymore. For a short period in modern history, childhood had a very unusual balance, enormous freedom mixed with real responsibility. And that combination created a psychological blueprint that is surprisingly powerful even decades later. People who grew up during that time often talk about it with a kind of disbelief. They say things like, "We didn't realize how good we had it," or "I wish I could go back and live there again." Not because life was perfect, but because childhood felt wide open. It was unpredictable, unsupervised, and strangely empowering. One of the biggest psychological differences starts with something very simple: learning how to solve your own problems. Back then, boredom wasn't treated like a crisis that needed to be fixed immediately. If a child complained about having nothing to do, the usual response wasn't entertainment or a screen. It was something closer to, "Then go figure something out." And that small moment forced the brain into a powerful kind of training. When children are left with unstructured time, they have to invent their own world. They build games, explore outside, read endlessly, or wander through their neighborhood looking for something interesting. Their brain learns how to turn emptiness into curiosity. Modern research on childhood development shows that this kind of unstructured play strengthens executive function, creativity, and long-term planning. In other words, the brain becomes better at generating its own motivation instead of waiting for stimulation. For many people who grew up during that era, entire afternoons were spent outside with no schedule at all. Riding bikes through unfamiliar streets, exploring empty fields, climbing trees just to see how high they could go. It wasn't organized. It wasn't supervised. And that unpredictability trained the brain in ways structured childhood rarely does. But creativity wasn't the only thing developing. There was another psychological skill forming quietly in the background: learning how to judge risk. Children back then encountered real physical challenges constantly. They climbed things that were probably too high. They built ramps that were probably too dangerous. They played games that occasionally ended with scraped knees or bruises. And every one of those moments taught the nervous system something important. Instead of being protected from every possible risk, the brain learned how to measure danger on its own. It learned the difference between something that felt scary and something that was actually threatening. Developmental psychologists have found that children who experience manageable physical risks during play often develop stronger confidence and lower baseline anxiety as adults. Their brain becomes better at distinguishing real danger from imagined fear. That's why many people from that generation seem unusually calm in stressful situations. When chaos appears, their instinct is often to step forward and start solving the problem instead of freezing. But the most overlooked difference might be something much quieter: the ability to be alone with your thoughts. Before constant digital stimulation, silence was normal. Long stretches of time passed without notifications, messages, or entertainment algorithms trying to grab your attention. A child could spend hours lying on the floor, listening to music, sitting outside, watching the sky, or simply thinking. Those moments looked like boredom from the outside, but inside the brain, something important was happening. The mind was learning how to sit with itself. Psychologists studying prodigal childhoods have noticed that people who grew up without constant connectivity often show a higher tolerance for solitude and significantly lower anxiety. When they are alone, in modern experiments, participants sometimes prefer mild electric shocks over sitting quietly with their thoughts for a few minutes. For many people from earlier generations, that idea sounds absurd, because silence never felt threatening. It felt normal, and that quiet mental space allowed patience to develop in ways that are increasingly rare today. Entertainment didn't arrive instantly. If you loved a television show, you waited an entire week to see the next episode. If you took photographs, you had no idea whether they turned out until days later. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called their home and hoped they answered. Life moved slower, and the brain adapted to that rhythm. Research on delayed gratification consistently shows that people who grow up waiting for rewards tend to develop stronger impulse control, better emotional regulation, and more resilience in adulthood. Their brains become comfortable with anticipation instead of needing constant reward. But perhaps the most powerful psychological shift came from one simple rule many children grew up with. Leave the house during the day and be back before the streetlights turn on. That was it. There were no location trackers, no constant updates, no adult supervising every decision. Children wandered through neighborhoods, explored forests, rode bikes miles away from home, and navigated unfamiliar situations on their own. That kind of independence forces the brain to grow quickly. You have to make decisions. You have to read situations. You have to learn from mistakes because no one is there to rescue you instantly. Studies on childhood autonomy show that kids who experience real independence often develop stronger internal motivation and better problem-solving skills later in life. They learn to trust their own judgment. And that trust becomes part of their personality long after childhood ends. So, when people from that generation look at today's world and feel slightly out of place, it's not because they're outdated, it's because their mental wiring was shaped by conditions that barely exist anymore. What might look like emotional distance is often self-reliance. What might look like silence is often deep comfort with solitude. What might look like stubborn patience is actually discipline learned over decades. They grew up in a rare moment where childhood was both wild and formative at the same time. Kids had freedom, but they also had responsibility. They were independent, but they were still learning the consequences of their choices. And that strange balance created adults who can tolerate boredom, navigate uncertainty, and stay calm when things fall apart. For a brief window in history, childhood offered something incredibly valuable. Not constant protection, but the chance to become capable.